Michael, will you make a backup recording?
Okay.
Just in case anything happens with mine. Everybody, let's bow in. Good evening, everyone. So tonight we're going to do several chapters, starting with chapter 15 of Mingyur Rinpoche's book, In Love with the World. And this chapter is entitled Memento Mori, Remembering Death. So it starts out he could no longer stay in the dormitory of the station in Varanasi. He'd left his monastery, Terlar, if you recall, and he had been spending a couple of nights in the dormitory at the train station in Varanasi, which cost almost nothing, but he wasn't allowed to stay more than a couple of nights, along with a bunch of other beggars and poor people. From where he sat on the stone floor, he could see a group of foreigners, white, speaking English, perhaps American. They were making plans to visit Varanasi and then Sarnath. Varanasi, is this very large city. It's the old name. It's supposedly one of the most ancient cities in the world, perhaps as old as 3,000 years old. And its modern name is Benares. And a short distance outside of Varanasi is the town of Sarnath, where the Buddha first taught. After he achieved enlightenment, at first he thought he couldn't communicate what he had discovered. It was beyond words. But he met some previous fellow mendicants, people who had been studying and practicing with, and they saw that something was different, and they asked him for teachings. So at Sarnath, which is just a short distance outside of Varanasi, about 8 miles, 20 minutes, something like that, he gave the first teachings on the first truth of suffering, first of the Four Noble Truths. And that was his very first teaching ever. He thought to himself that maybe these Americans were seeking inner transformation. They were certain to go to the Ghats, and we've discussed the Ghats, where the public rituals for the dying create an intense spiritual experience for the living. And it is a very intense place. You can smell the burning flesh because they're burning the bodies and then scattering the ashes. And the Ghats is just upstream from where everybody gathers at Varanasi on the first of the Ghats. And there's smoke coming up, and then they scatter the ashes into the river, the Ganges, as well as corpses that from people who are too poor to have them burned, their corpse of their loved one burned, so they just dump it in the river and let it float down. And as it floats down, along with the ashes and everything else in that river, that's where people are bathing, brushing their teeth, shitting, pissing, doing every darn thing. Oh, doing sun worship. That was a good one. Yeah, both on the Ghats, on the terraces, and in the water. And when I went there were thousands of people lining the Ghats and going up, waiting their turn to come down to the river and bathe in the holy water. And when I asked my guide, I said, "Is this a particularly holy day that so many people are here?" He said, "Oh, yes." He said, "This is a very holy day." And I said, "How many such days are there?" And my guide, who was an old Hindu man, said, "Oh, 300. That was funny. And Rinpoche tells the story of the French skier who took refuge in a monastery in the Alps and was awakened every hour throughout the night by the monks reminding him, memento mori, remember death. You live your life differently if you do. Rinpoche thinks that when they go to the Ghats, when people go to the Ghats, if they're fortunate, they would see a body burning in the river's edge and would breathe in the smell of the burnt flesh and know without doubt that they will die. It's very powerful. He bought a guidebook about India that described the 4 principal Buddhist pilgrimage sites. Lumbini, where the Buddha was born. I went there, it's in Nepal. When I went there, it was early 1980s. No one there, no one along the way. I hired a guide in a car, and they drove me in, and you go past peasants working in the fields, in these water, there's like the ponds with grain growing in them, and the peasant will be standing in the middle of the pond, winnowing it and agriculturing it. And you drive along a road that's on a raised platform past all of these people to Lumbini, and you get to Lumbini and there's nothing there. At least in those days, there was hardly anything. There was a Shaivite temple, and there was a Shaivite means Shiva, Shiva, a Shiva monk, Shiva priest, and he came out of the temple and greeted me. That was what was at Lumbini, where the Buddha was born. And then the other spots, let's see if I can remember them all. Kushinagra, where he died, you can go to that. That's actually in India. Lumbini is in Nepal, technically. It's over the border. And Kushinagra is where the Buddha died. Sarnath, we already spoke of, it's where he gave the first teachings, which are on the 4 Noble Truths, especially the truth of suffering. And what is the 4th one? Skipping my mind. Can you remember, Michael?
This is Bodh Gaya, where he attained enlightenment, Lumbini, when he was born, Sarnath, where the 4 Noble Truths, and Kushinagara, where he went into parinirvana.
And Bodh Gaya. And you can go to Bodh Gaya today. It's quite a hike from Sarnath, from Varanasi and Sarnath. And there's the big temple. It's huge, it's sort of like, looks like the Eiffel Tower in a way, and rises up, and this is the memorial to the Buddha's enlightenment. This book described the prediction made at the Buddha's birth that he would grow either into an influential political or spiritual leader. That prediction was made by a soothsayer at the Buddha's birth. And his father, of course, didn't want him to become a spiritual leader. He wanted to become a great world leader, Chakravartin. So he sequestered the Buddha within the palace and surrounded him with luxuries, beautiful women and food and wealth and all kinds. But it backfired. And the Buddha became sick of it, and he left on his own, sort of snuck out. And when he saw the suffering that people endured in the world, which he had never seen before, as a young man now, he gave up the life of the palace, never to return. And he set out on the path that eventually became him becoming the Buddha. Yeah, let's see. What if a modern Buddha to be escaped the artificially perfected life and came to Varanasi? Varanasi was the best place to learn about sickness, old age, and death. It really was. Even in modern times. It's incredible. It's the oldest city in the world, over 3,000 years old, supposedly. Nobody really knows. And full of immense suffering. What about the 4th encounter that I had in the village with the contained and centered ascetic in robes? I had one. Someone who might have resembled Mingyur Rinpoche. What might he inspire? I encountered this kind of person. When the prince ran away from his father, I mean, if you go to India and you travel alone, with your own money and you're going to have amazing adventures and amazing encounters with people that you've never encountered before. When the prince ran away from his father's estate, he died as Gautama. He gave up his life of luxury to follow the aesthetic principles of a forest yogi. He barely ate, slept on the ground, never washed. What does that denied comfort to the body as a means for awakening the mind? But after 6 years, extreme austerities had not led to a liberated mind. In order to pursue his path, he needed to renounce asceticism too. The book then moved on to Bodh Gaya, where Gautama sat under the Bodhi tree, and what today is the Mahabodhi temple. Here is where Siddhartha was born as the Buddha, the awakened one. And the amazing thing about it is you can relive this. You, each one of us. You go there, it is so powerful. The loneliness, the poverty, the immensity. His next step was to leave the station. He achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. This was a tree that was right there at Bodh Gaya. Yet enlightenment is not some new state of consciousness that is being achieved as though it is an object to be obtained or something to strive for outside of ourselves. The Buddha saw that his grasping mind was the problem. After years of trying to control the mind and deny the most basic needs of his body, he had become an extreme ascetic, at one point during his travels and his peregrinations, and wasted away to almost nothing, eating nothing. He made the decision to stop trying to get enlightened and to simply sit down and look at his own mind in order to see what he could learn from directly observing his experience in the present moment. That is what he did under what is now called the Bodhi tree, a peepal tree. This is where, just outside the temple that they built, which is called Bodh Gaya now. What he discovered is that our true nature is already awake, already perfect as it is, and that what he initially sought to attain was already within him. And that are words that you could write and put on a magnet on your refrigerator. Our true nature is already awake, already perfect as it is, and it is already within us. The insight that the Buddha discovered was so simple and yet so difficult to accept, the dormant, hidden, unrealized part of ourselves. This is the great paradox of the Buddhist path, that we practice in order to know what we already are, that we're already this. Therefore, attaining nothing, getting nothing, going nowhere, we seek to uncover what has already been there. In Sarnath, only 7 miles from Varanasi, the Buddha taught for the first time, expounding on the truth of suffering, inspired by these 4 once fellow practitioners who realized that he was different now. This gives the non-Buddhists the false impression that this tradition is nihilistic, even morbid, and preoccupied with mental anguish. It's certainly not. Where does all this suffering arise from? Clearly, our own lives and those of our loved ones will not last forever. We will be parted from family and those we love, even from our own bodies. Our relationships, health, finances, reputations, and so forth are not stable, and to think they are is a serious mistake, as many of us have already learned through loss and abrupt change. Even now, the World Trade Towers have fallen, the Titanic has sunk to the ocean floor, the Bamiyan Buddhists have been blown off the earth. What other catastrophes have happened? And we still get fooled into hoping that structures are lasting. Nothing lasts. The Buddha's truth is that we do have a choice. We can try to avoid our inner demons, our fears of change and death, our rage and jealousy. These give our adversaries greater power. The more we run away, the less chance we have of escaping. We're trying to escape what's already within us. Think of all the sorrow and pain and suffering and fear that each one of us houses, lives. The more we run away, the less chance we have of escaping. We must face suffering, move into it. Only then can we become free from it. This is the first noble truth that the Buddha taught at Sarnath. Sarnath was a little grove of trees, and he was there with these 4 students who recognized that he had changed. He suddenly saw that he could spend a long time in this place, for he had reverted to his old skin, the role of teacher. He needed to go forth with his head bowed in humility, his heart in supplication, in humility, his heart in supplication to whatever arose. The last major site is Kushinagar, where the Buddha died around 487 BC. This is where the tour would come to an end, only 50 miles to the northwest of where it began. This is where he lived, northern India. He had been here many years earlier with his brother, Mingyur Rinpoche. And so Sakni Rinpoche bought a ticket. Whoops. For the next train to Gorakhpur. And there he would catch a bus to Kushinagar. About 500 years after the dialogue between the monk Nagasena and the king at the time, the same deconstruction of self was rephrased by the 8th century Indian master Shantideva, only he took it a step further. And here it is. The teeth, the hair, the nails are not I. And I is not the bones or blood. The mucus from the nose, the phlegm are not I. And neither is it made from lymph or pus. The eye is not the body's grease or sweat. The lungs and liver likewise do not constitute it. This is for each of us. Neither are the inner organs I, nor yet the body's excrement and waste. Then Shantideva asks, if such a thing as I exists indeed, then terrors granted will torment it. But since no self or I exists at all, what is there left for fear to terrify? Boy, that's something to inscribe somewhere. So beautiful, so elegant. If we play along with Nagasena and Shantideva, it's easy to conclude that this I, this recipient of terrors, does not exist, and yet, this I that cannot be found, that is essentially transparent and fluid as water, can still get so hurt, as we all know. Without any training, he says, I might have concluded that the railway station was the problem in Varanasi, not my mind. True, the railway station could have used some rat control and had more efficient services for cleaning up litter and poop and people shot on the floor. But when we look at our middle-class lives or the lives of those who live vermin-free with sufficient food and soft chairs, we do not encounter much contentment. Think of all the suffering you see among the rich and even among us, who are the relative rich. The Buddha taught that the mind is the source of suffering and the source of liberation. He says, when I, Mingyur, started traveling to modern industrialized countries, nothing in the world affirmed this foundational truth more than first-hand encounters with the tormented anguish that coexists with God realm splendor. And don't we see it? We're living in God realm splendor. Most of us. All of us. God realm splendor. Compared to go to Varanasi. And then you'll realize this is God realm splendor. Without personal transformation and without some sense of humility, even with regard to the universe itself, greed and anger are pushing us over the cliff. It seems that without acknowledging the way each of us sets ourselves up to receive the arrows, we must keep slinging them at each other, misperceiving the source of our anguish to be outside ourselves, misperceiving the source of our suffering and sorrow to be outside of ourselves. Then he says this time when he boarded the train, he felt like an old hand at third-class rail, less intimidated by the dirt and discomfort. Even though Varanasi had been unexpectedly difficult, he departed feeling less disoriented than when he had arrived. This allowed him to continue instead of returning to Bodh Gaya for comfort. And so he continued on his journey. Now that I had a more relaxed mind, I found that though my companions looked as destitute as on the previous trip, they no longer represented a foreign brigade and displayed none of the hostility I had first encountered in Varanasi. I noticed how often they smiled, how they shared their meager supplies of food, how gently they held their children. And this is so true. The poor in India have such heart and feeling and are so human. They'll touch your heart. Once again, I concluded that modern urban people seem more stressed and agitated than poor rural people. Having material comforts seems to make people more possessive, afraid of losing their positions, always wanting more and more and more and never satisfied. Disadvantaged people in Nepal and India with much lower expectations seemed more satisfied with what little they had. I had begun to recognize not the problems that beset modern people at the peak of their family and work lives, closely parallel issues that arise for people everywhere at the end of life, and the inability to accept impermanence, grasping at what is not available, and not being able to let go. Underlying so much anxiety in the modern world is the fear of death. And I think this will become more and more apparent for each of us as we get older and older. I think, I'm just looking here, my guess is that maybe Carolyn and I are the oldest people here. It's a coming. It really is, and I'm just watching my body fall apart and become more and more difficult to be in. So the question is, will death be painful? Will it be difficult? Will there be guilt, remorse, or redemption? Wow. People everywhere are afraid of dying. I wondered how my father's generation of masters, this is him speaking, Mingyur Rinpoche, had dealt with this. And I remember my own father, personally, John Baker's father, Edward Baker. He died at 60 of a disease called multiple myeloma. I had spent the night at the house to be there when he died, and I missed it because I got up in the morning and I went to brush my teeth before going in to see him, and he had died just then. And my mother had been with him, and she said his last words were, "I never thought it would be like this." Brace yourselves. Many of the older generation of teachers, including my father, his father, Utuba Ujin. Is it Tuku Ujin is his father, Michael? Yeah. Wanted to do a wandering retreat, yet after the Chinese invasion of Tibet in the 1950s, there was a tremendous sense of responsibility on the part of lamas, especially tulkus and lineage holders, to maintain the tradition. The rebuilding of monasteries in exile and the training of young monks took precedence over personal retreats. He was very fortunate to have been born in Nepal and never had to endure the dangerous escape from Tibet. There are accounts of that trip over the Himalayas that you can read. Remember the titles of some of them, Michael?
Tulku Ujin's text?
No, just texts by other people who fled Tibet and wrote about their journey over the Himalayas into India.
Oh, well, there's Trungpa Rinpoche's Born in Tibet, but also another book from Lion's Jaws that was written based on interviews with people who accompanied Trungpa Rinpoche out of Tibet.
That's right, from Lion's
It
Jaws.
actually does a really good job of describing how really difficult that was.
Right. What's his name? He was an American.
I can't remember his name.
Yeah, American wrote that, From Lion's Jaws. Worth reading. Also, there's Rinpoche's book, Escape from Tibet? No.
Born in Tibet. Born in
Tibet. But that's very tame. He was very modest, and he didn't write a very shocking book. From Lion's Jaws. That is a shocker. Tibetan Buddhism had stabilized enough in Nepal and India to allow for his absence from responsibilities to his lineage and to the monasteries that he had inherited from his incarnation. The work of rebuilding the monasteries that had been accomplished by the older generation of Tibetan masters had made this retreat possible. Now that he was on his own, he recalled their sacrifice with renewed appreciation. For weeks, Mingyur Rinpoche's mind had swiveled from excitedly looking forward to looking backward with a touch of sadness. He endured many moments of doubting if he could go through with this plan. So much of his introduction to Dharma, as with all Tibetan kids, had taken the form of unforgettable stories. One in particular was about a relative of his father's. This story was about Patrul Rinpoche. He keeps coming up over and over and over, Patrul Rinpoche. You should just treasure that book of Patrul Rinpoche's. Amazing book. We studied it here. My perfect teacher. It's gorgeous. Patrul Rinpoche wished for nothing more than to live in the mountains, unrecognized, a shabby beggar. Patrul Rinpoche might give teaching from the abbot's seat, or he might be shunned, served the best food, or given a handful of barley flour and told to keep moving. Either way was fine with him. Mingyur Rinpoche wondered if he could train his mind to be that steady in all circumstances, accepting whatever arose. In this particular story, a young man caught up with Patrul Rinpoche during a journey that the venerated master was making in the company of several other lamas. One night they slept in a field at the base of a high pass. During the night, word spread that Patrul Rinpoche was nearby, and the pilgrims awoke to shouts of excited devotees scrambling down the mountain footpaths from their villages to make prostrations and present offerings. One man stepped forward with an exceptionally large, heavy gold coin. He told Patrul Rinpoche that a family member had just died. He held out the coin and asked for prayers. Patrul Rinpoche said he would happily offer prayers, but he had no need of the coin. The man insisted, explaining that he could not accept the prayers if Patrul Rinpoche did not accept the coin. This went back and forth until Patrul Rinpoche said, "Okay, I will accept the coin, and after the prayers, I will give it back to you." The man agreed, but after Patrul Rinpoche offered prayers, the man refused to take back the coin. Everybody was leaving, so finally Patrul Rinpoche said, "Let's put the coin down on this rock and leave it here." The young monk had a very difficult time leaving the gold coin on that rock. However many times my father told me this story, he always made sure that I understood the main points. You will have 1,000 chances to choose between a negative and a positive direction, meaning increasing or decreasing suffering for yourself and others. And if you really aspire to cut your attachments, you can do it no matter what the circumstances. But there will always be something pulling you back in the other direction. It will never be easy, but it can be done. This is our challenge. He says that he understood that feeling the pull of what he valued and loved, what is familiar, is a necessary part of cutting attachments. He also started to see that dying to the old self and being reborn as something new would not happen overnight. He was not in the familiar settings of a monastery, but he was still too much himself. Mingyur Rinpoche, to sit comfortably on the floor among strangers. And then he says, but this would change, I was sure of it. He tried to imagine what his father would say to him in that moment, but he could not. And he fell asleep on the train. And with that, I thought that was an amazingly moving chapter. What a story. Michael, you want to take over?
Okay. So,
One thing, Michael, before we go further, I want to tell people we're not going to be having class next week. Michael and I will both be away. So we're going to skip class. I'm sorry.
okay. So, before moving ahead, I actually wanted to go back for a moment and say just a couple of things about chapter 13 on sleep and dreams that we read for last week, because as I said in discussion group last Wednesday, I felt that I wasn't completely clear on a couple of important points. And when we get to the second of the two chapters we're talking about tonight, I think some of the things that were brought up in chapter 13 will be helpful to keep in mind. And before doing that, so now we'll start. I just wanted to begin by saying something that comes out of the Madhyamaka tradition. It's Madhyamaka, that's the school of teaching founded by Nagarjuna, that really looks into the nature of emptiness. And they, in the Madhyamaka tradition, talk about three different levels, I guess you could say, of how we perceive things. The first is called the level of no analysis, where we just take things the way that we've been conventionally taught, socially, culturally, developmentally, things are. And there can be greater or lesser degrees of confusion within no analysis, but it's essentially a dualistic way of looking at the world. Again, the degree of confusion within the level of no analysis can vary greatly, but it's not a clear perception of things as they are. Then they talk about the level of slight analysis, which is when we begin to realize and look at the world in a different way, and begin to actually investigate or look into and analyze what we experience, what we perceive. And then finally at the stage of thorough analysis, which is essentially enlightenment, basically, where things are seen exactly as they are, dharmata, things as they are. The level of slight analysis, which is what we are really approaching in this class, involves looking at things, analyzing things, investigating things from the point of view of the Dharma. So that, for instance, when Mingyur Rinpoche in this text, as he has over and over again, asks us to consider impermanence and to reflect on impermanence and contemplate impermanence, that's the level of slight analysis. If we're able to take it to its full logical conclusion, that might bring us to thorough analysis. But for the most part, we work on the level of slight analysis, on the level of working with something or different things that the Buddha taught and that lineage teachers since the time of the Buddha have taught, and that this begins to change how we see things. And of course, part of that also happens through the practice of meditation, which is taught by these teachers. That we begin with shamatha meditation, where we learn to, by working with an object of meditation, to bring us back from distraction. Most commonly, object of meditation being the breath, but visual object will work. You can really work with any sense perception that's fairly continuous, but the breath works particularly well, and it's probably the most common object of meditation. But the point ultimately isn't the breath, it's coming back. It's being able to be present. It's able to recollect being settled in this present moment. And when we're able to settle in this present moment, then we can look at our experience more directly, with less distraction, and with less absorption in conceptual mind, less absorption in the level of no analysis, essentially. So this is what we work with in meditation practice. Now in chapter 13, which is the chapter of sleep and dreams, Mingyur Rinpoche asks us to look at this process that we go through as we fall asleep, which he says parallels or is somewhat analogous to the bardo of dying, to look at what we experience in the dreaming, or the bardo of dreaming, which has some parallels, some similarity to the bardo of dharmata and the experience after death, and to look at what we experience as we wake up in the morning after a night's sleep. And that he says that has some parallel to the bardo of becoming, that stage in the after-death experience where consciousness begins to look for a new body. When we actually look at these different experiences, falling asleep, dreaming, and what we experience upon first waking up, if we really contemplate what we experience in those moments, what we can begin to see is something of what Buddhism is talking about in regard to emptiness and egolessness, or identitylessness, as some teachers call it, selflessness. Egolessness, identitylessness, selflessness being the lack of a real, permanent, singular self, soul, whatever we want to talk about it. That in fact, when we look, we can see in falling asleep, as he says, that we let go of all of that, that the self just dissolves, that the senses turn inward, and that what seems to be so what seems to us to what we misperceive as being so solid and continuous, in fact, isn't continuous at all. And then when we wake up, we have a moment where there's again a gap, maybe very brief, until we kind of reload, kind of run the programs again and determine who we are, what we are, and have to, again, sort of recreate some sense of ego, some sense of self on the spot. So there are gaps. These gaps happen all the time, but if we actually look at these experiences, we can begin to see this. The bardo of dreams, or the experience of dreaming, actually that was a bit more complicated, because he actually talks about different ways that we can contemplate our dream experience. But one of them was to look at what we think is real, and that we tend to look at the dream experience as not being real when we wake up, and yet when we are dreaming, it seems very real. He also says that we could look at dreaming from the point of view that it's clearly an experience created entirely by mind. There is no external or very real external reality to dreaming. It's all interior. It's all mind, and yet we take that to be real. And in the same way, it's said in the teachings that we create the world that we experience in waking life. It's a different type of consciousness than we experience in dreaming, but that we create the world that we experience in waking life. And that also is mind. And sometimes, as we know, we wake up in that. We realize in meditation or even in daily life, we'll be completely caught up in thoughts. And then suddenly we're back and we realize, oh, I was really preoccupied. I was really fantasizing about relationship or worrying about bills or whatever might preoccupy us during the day. He also talks about the nature of dream images and how what we experience in a dream, again, seems real, but is actually, as he says, fleeting, translucent, mirage-like. And that, in fact, although we tend to dichotomize our experience by saying dreams aren't real, waking life is real, in fact, we could look into this more to begin to let go of the solidity, as he says, of our fixed perceptions of things. As he says, a rigid mind demands that everything conforms to its expectations. But in fact, contemplating dreams and contemplating the nature of what we experience in dreams can help us begin to let go. Also, that what we experience as a self in dreams, again, we can see is empty, doesn't have any real solidity. So contemplating all these things is helpful in beginning to develop a sense of what egolessness and emptiness means. That emptiness, as he said in one of the previous chapters, and as he'll say again in one of the chapters we're talking about tonight, on the one hand, things lack any kind of solidity, any kind of permanence, any kind of singularity, any kind of real independence from causes and conditions, and yet they do appear. And when they say appear, it makes us think automatically of visual appearance. But actually, what they're talking about is any appearance to mind. So any appearance of mind could be anything that we experience: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, thoughts, memories, emotions. All of those are appearances from that point of view. And that all of them are creations of mind. And all of them, on the one hand, as he'll say, are embodied experiences. We feel them, we see them, we experience them, but that they don't exist in the way that we conventionally take things to be. And that the point of chapter 13 of Sleep and Dreams, one of the points, I should say, there's actually, his teachings are profound and they could be understood in a lot of different ways. But one of them is to really, again, to contemplate on the level of slight analysis, what do we take to be real? What does it mean when we take something to be real? And what effect does it have when we take something to be real? Because certainly at least on the level of the Hinayana teachings, the misperception that a self truly exists is the source of a great deal of suffering and confusion, grasping, passion, aggression, and ignorance. And that attachment altogether to things that are impermanent and thinking that they're going to last is the source of suffering, as he said. So with all of that, now we'll go ahead into chapter 16. But I hope what I've just said will be helpful when we get to chapter 17, which again relates to dreaming. And I just wanted to rewind a little bit before we go ahead. So chapter 16 begins with his journey to Kushinagar, and which is again one of the four main pilgrimage sites of the Buddha, his birth, where he attained enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, Sarnath, where he taught the Four Noble Truths, his first teaching, and then Kushinagar, where he died. And I just want to show a few pictures from the pilgrimage that Sue and I did in India in 2023. And so let's see if this will work. Okay, so this actually is the This is the Ananda Stupa in Vaishali. It was in Vaishali that the Buddha gave his final sermon, in which he actually predicted his death, his parinirvana. And it was this stupa, which is actually called the Ananda Stupa because it's said to contain the remains of Ananda, who was one of the Buddha's attendants, is said to be the location where he gave that final teaching of, in which he predicted his own parinirvana. So this is the Ananda Stupa in the middle, and then the pillar actually was erected by Ashoka, and it's one of the few intact Ashoka pillars. Ashoka lived about maybe 200 to 300 years after the Buddha's death and was a great ruler, emperor in India. And after a particularly bloody battle, became dismayed at all the death that he caused and became a very devout patron of Buddhism, became a complete convert to Buddhism. And he erected pillars in all the major sites. Many of them are in ruins now, but this one's intact and actually has a lion on top, and that is actually the symbol that's on the Indian flag today. And Ananda, again, was an attendant to the Buddha. Two things that are interesting about Ananda. One is that he really, the Buddha's stepmother, his mother died shortly after his birth, but his stepmother actually raised him, was mother's sister, I believe. And she, after her husband's death, wanted to become a nun and beseeched the Buddha to allow nuns to enter the monastic order. And at first the Buddha refused, and there are different ideas about why that might have been. But she actually followed the Buddha with some other women who also wanted to become nuns, who also wanted to take ordination. And Ananda actually spoke to the Buddha about it and asked the Buddha, asked the Buddha about allowing women to become ordained. And finally, the Buddha did decide to do that. And the other thing is Ananda was known for having a great memory. A lot of the sutras actually are based on the very detailed recollections of Ananda. And he attended all the Buddhist sutras, all the Buddhist teachings. So Ananda was an important figure in the development of Buddhism. So as Mingyur Rinpoche says, in contrast to Varanasi, the landscape becomes increasingly more rural. These are some pictures that we took as we were on the road there, on the way to Kushinagar. And you can kind of see that here. And again, this is a stupa that was built on between Vaishali and Kushinagar. A number of people actually followed the Buddha as he began to walk north. It's not entirely clear where the Buddha was, whether the Buddha wanted to die in Kushinagar or was trying to get back to Lumbini. That's one of the things that's unclear in the histories. But he had a number of people following him, a number of monks and followers. And at the site of this particular stupa, which was buried and then uncovered again, it's said that the Buddha actually created an illusion of a river so that most people could not follow him, and only a few of his closest attendants and students followed. So this is the stupa that was built at the site where the Buddha performed this miracle. And here you can see just some of the remaining statues and ruins. This is actually the stupa at Kushinagar, where it's said that the Buddha died. This is the place where the Buddha actually died. And as Mingyur Rinpoche describes, there's a statue of the reclining Buddha inside the stupa, and it said this is the very location where the Buddha passed. In Mingyur Rinpoche's text, he says that his head is facing north, that he's lying on his right hand, as you can see. Head facing north means that he was actually facing west, because it said that the Buddha liked to watch the setting sun, and that in fact he died watching the sunset. So this is it is about, I think in the text it says it's something like 20 feet long. It's a big statue. But this is again in Kushinagar on the other side. And then this is a stupa nearby that's said to contain some of the relics of the Buddha. Actually, after his cremation, the Buddha's relics were divided into 8 and sent to different places around India, some back to Lumbini as well, where his family was from. So that was Kushinagar. That was where the Buddha actually entered into parinirvana, watching the sunset at age 80. So, to chapter 16, where the Buddha died. And we're now in the second half of this book altogether, which is titled Returning Home. The first half of the book wasn't adding wood to the fire. It was the overall heading. So as we go along in these chapters, we'll see what returning home means. So he says the bus ride from Gorakhpur to Kushinagar was about an hour and a half. And as he said, the landscape became more rural and remote. And he talks about the different vehicles you'd see on the road, including horses hitched to carts, which is true. You have modern vehicles, you have bicycle, every kind of vehicle you can imagine on some of the highways in India. And he comments altogether about his experience so far in this wandering retreat. He says he had stayed aware of the turbulence in his mind, but which remained at the surface. So again, going back to the analogy that he gave early on about the ocean and waves, that he hasn't lost sight of the ocean, that all the waves of thought, waves of emotion, waves of embarrassment and turbulence have arisen. He's remained aware of the deeper nature of mind. He hasn't been swept away by the waves and lost his seat, lost his capacity for remaining aware. As he said, deeper down, I feel alert, confident, even content. And he says he knows the turbulence isn't the real problem. So we'll have to look and see what the real problem is. He talks about still wanting to be reborn as a carefree wandering yogi, that he doesn't want to live as a prince trapped in a sanitized environment, as the Buddha was, as John talked about. And he says if the point of meditation were to simply get rid of negative emotions, he wouldn't be interested in practicing at all. So this is an important point, that we don't want to give in to negative emotions. We don't want to be swept away by negative emotions and act on passion, aggression, and ignorance. But we're not trying to get rid of them either. We're just trying to not be caught up in them, not lose our awareness, not lose a greater view, a greater perspective. And that's actually, I think, what the real problem is our tendency to lose our perspective, get swept away, get caught up, lose our seat. He talks about the Parinirvana Park, which is, again, the land around where the Buddha died, where that statue was that I showed just a moment ago. He says he walked into that stupa and did 3 prostrations to the Buddha, and he prayed. And I think that his prayers were interesting. These are his aspirations, his intentions. His first aspiration, or his first prayer, was to stay connected to timeless awareness. That's the very essence of all turbulent emotions. So I think that's actually the deeper problem, is being able to see the essence of whatever we experience as timeless awareness, as opposed to getting swept away by the waves and thinking the wave is the real thing and losing the awareness that pervades all experience. So stay connected to the timeless awareness that is the very essence of all turbulent emotions. His second prayer was to allow feelings of discomfort, and particularly embarrassment, because that was his particular most turbulent experience that he had in Varanasi, or one of the ones that he saw as a real obstacle. To allow feelings of discomfort and especially embarrassment to self-liberate, to let feelings be and to hold them within awareness. In other words, not to get rid of emotions, but to be able to be with them while not getting caught up in them, while not being swept away with them, so that they do self-liberate, that developing the stability and the wisdom to see that if we're just able to simply be with our experience and see the essence of our experience, that negative emotions of all kinds naturally self-liberate. He prayed for the courage, this was his third prayer, prayed for the courage to welcome negative emotions and to try to work with them. So again, rather than shunning or avoiding difficult experiences, to actually welcome them, to see them as opportunities to expand or develop awareness further, to again strengthen that ability to stay with timeless awareness. That's the very essence of all turbulent emotions. Along with that, this is the fourth prayer, prayed to see the waves not as monsters or other threatening obstacles, but as displays of enlightened activity that reflected the true nature of his own mind. To see them waves not as monsters or threatening obstacles, but as displays of enlightened activity that reflected the true nature of his own mind. And then 5, he prayed to deepen his understanding so that he could be of more benefit to all sentient beings, which is ultimately the purpose, from the point of view of Bodhisattva, of all practice, is to be able to benefit all beings. So I think just having some understanding of exactly what he's praying to do, what he's aspiring to do, is again really helpful in guiding our practice and our willingness to work with not just the easy things we experience, but perhaps some of the more difficult experiences we might have. Anyway, he circled the park and found a place that he wanted to do meditation practice the next morning, and checked into a guest house called Dharamsala, which means pilgrimage house. And he says from here, so this is his base, the guest house now in Kushinagar, that this is his base where he would, as he says, tentatively test the homeless life. And he's reminding himself, don't be in a rush. I'll stay on this bridge for as long as I need to, becoming homeless, becoming familiar with this new way. So I think what he is experiencing for himself here, and what we could take as a teaching, is not being aggressive in our practice, that not looking to, that we can be gentle to ourselves, even as we do our best to relate to turbulent emotions and to challenges, that he doesn't try to throw himself into situations, but he's allowing space and time for there to be a path, as opposed to having some kind of fixed idea about a goal that he wants to accomplish that he's going to force himself into. So again, don't be in a rush. I'll stay in this bridge for as long as I need to. And he says that this dormitory and guest house would be his safe ground from which to, as he says, and I quote him directly here, expand my edges so far beyond the boundaries of what I knew about myself that there would be no me left to feel self-conscious. So on the one hand, he's being gentle with himself and taking things a step at a time. But ultimately, this is the goal, which is quite radical, to expand my edges so far beyond the boundaries of what I knew about myself that there would be no me left to feel self-conscious. As he says, there'd be no roles to play, no expectations to be fulfilled, and no titles to be honored. But he admits in all of this, and he comes back again to the need to be gentle with oneself, to be realistic with oneself, to, as Pema Chodron, one of her books titled, Start Where We Are. He says, I'd gotten ahead of myself, and he says his father told him not to be impatient. And he says that he'd realized he had mistaken adding wood to the fire for an event, as if, in other words, that adding wood to the fire as if it were just a single thing. And now he's realizing that instead he should understand it as a process. In other words, as a path, that it's not a one and done. It's not like one single thing, but it's something that we work with over time. And he said somewhere in his imaginings, he'd confused adding one skinny stick of kindling at a time with getting mixed up with igniting a bonfire. So I think, again, there's a message in there about, on the one hand, being diligent and, taking on challenges in our practice, but at the same time, not being aggressive with ourselves or unrealistic and forcing ourselves to do something that we're not quite ready to do. That we'll get there, but we don't have to rush. We can as he says, stay on this bridge for as long as we need to. So with that, we enter chapter 17, which is titled, What is Your Happy Dream? So we're back to dreams and some contemplation again on emptiness and some at least slight analysis on the nature of emptiness and egolessness and selflessness. So he says that night he had another disturbing dream, which he describes as being surrounded by police officers who push him into a car and take him back to a monastery. And as he says, he hadn't woken up in the dream. He hadn't experienced lucid dreaming. And he felt that in taking the dream energy as real. So again, we're being asked to consider what it means. What does it mean to say something is real? And what does it do when we take something as real? He said in taking the dream energy as real, he had allowed fear to once again gain the upper hand. And then in the italicized commentaries, where he sort of is sharing with us his reflection on his experiences, he says it was a strange dream because he doesn't have negative associations with monasteries, but he also doesn't want his retreat interrupted and doesn't want to return. And then he says, in any case, it was just a dream. Good, bad, let it be. Anyway, he's more experienced, says he's more interested in how dreams affirm emptiness, how their translucent appearance. So again, he's talking about the nature of the images and experiences we have in a dream as being translucent appearance, reflects our own essential emptiness. So again, this is again a contemplation and a look at our experience, or at least a look at his experience, that might help us understand something about the nature of emptiness and egolessness, selflessness, identitylessness, whatever you want to call it. So he begins by talking about the lack of solidity in the dream experience. This again goes back to the translucent appearance of dream images, which again, in chapter 13, he said that we make a mistake when we create a dichotomy. We lose an opportunity to look at our experience, is really what he's saying. When we get into this dichotomy of saying, well, this life right now is real, and what I experience in dreams is unreal. And he's not saying one is necessarily more or less real than the other, but just that we can look at our experience. And again, slight analysis. He says, even though he had felt the police pushing on his body, pushing him into the car, he didn't have a sense of mass within his own body or in theirs. And he'd woken with a threat of menace. Again, the sense of being pushed into this car and taken back to the monastery. But when he actually looked at it, it had no shape and was no more or less real than the embarrassment he'd experienced in the Varanasi train station when he'd first sat down with homeless people there. At the same time, both the fear in the dream and the embarrassment in the train station were embodied experiences. So again, he's trying to help us see something of the nature of appearance, emptiness, that things appear in a certain way, things appear to our mind in a certain way. But at the same time, when we really look, they're not as solid as they seem. They're not lasting, permanent in the way that we might think. So then he goes into a description that begins with this question, what is your happy dream? Where he's talking about a person that he knew, a student who is a person from California. Just to summarize or remind you quickly of this part of the text, that the man had quit a great job after reading about emptiness and concluded that his work life, his job was empty. So he became an artist and made art and felt that he had a rewarding life. And he was attending teachings with Mingyur Rinpoche and decided that even the artwork was emptiness. So he needed to let go of doing art. But then he would have no money, and so he began to talk to Mingyur Rinpoche about what does this mean? What am I experiencing here? And the first thing that Mingyur Rinpoche says in his dialogue with this student, this person in California, who we're looking at what his happy dream is that emptiness does not mean nothing. It means that things are different from how we take them to be real, but it doesn't mean that they're nothing. And he says the man was shocked. And Mingyur Rinpoche said everything comes from emptiness. It's full of alive potential, full of possibility. So it's the very fact that things aren't fixed, that things aren't solid, that allows situations to change, allows this world to grow in the way that it does. And that, in fact, we're looking at endless cycles of death and rebirth, death and renewal, change, impermanence. So he asked the man, what's your happy dream? And the man said his happy dream would be to have a house on the beach. And Mingyur Rinpoche says, well, say you have a dream, a nice dream in which you have this beach house. Are you happy in this dream? And the man says, yes. And then Mingyur Rinpoche says, well, then if a fire burns it down, how would you feel? And the man says, it would break your heart. It would break my heart. And Mingyur Rinpoche says, is that house real or not? And the man says, of course it's not real, it's a dream. So Mingyur Rinpoche says, if you have a big problem like your beach house burning down, what would be the best solution? And the man says, maybe wake up to the dream. To wake up that ultimately he was holding on to something that didn't have real permanence, that didn't have, it wasn't as solid as he thought that it would be. Mingyur Rinpoche says, yes, if you know you're dreaming, then you can't be burned, or the tiger that's chasing you in the dream, it can't hurt you. In our daytime, now he goes into daytime life. In our daytime life, we don't deny wanting the house or the career. This goes back to the man feeling he had to give up his artwork. But if we recognize the essential emptiness phenomena, then we can enjoy our desires without getting attached to the misperceptions that cause suffering. So that again, it's not, he's bringing the man back to the point where he felt like even my artwork is empty. And he's saying the problem is the misperceptions. It's not the artwork in itself. It's getting attached to something, taking something to be more real than it really is. He says, Mingyur Rinpoche goes on to say, you and I right now, we're the same as that dream beach house. We're not real, but we're not nothing. Same thing again. There's an appearance, but at the same time it's empty of reality in the way that we typically think of reality. So he says, if you recognize the dream house in the dream and look at the dream house, you know it's not real. But you still see the dream house. It's still there, real and not real together. So again, what he's pointing to is that when we really look at our experience, that we come to see that much of what we experience in waking life is illusory. It appears, but it's not real in the way that we take it to be. This is the meaning of, for instance, in the Heart Sutra, where it talks about form as emptiness, emptiness as form. They're being presented as two different things so that we can conceptually understand it, but it's all one thing. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Appearance is emptiness, emptiness is appearance. So he says emptiness is not something negative, although from the point of view of ego it can seem that way, but we'll continue with what Mingyur Rinpoche is trying to teach here. That emptiness is not something negative. It's not an idea or a story, but it's actually embodied experience, which means that it has some kind of a form to it. That's literally what embodied means, to have some kind of form. That occurs when we explore experience itself. It's an embodied experience of emptiness that occurs when we explore experience ourselves. And he says explore experience itself. Again, he's really talking about analysis, investigating, what Trungpa Rinpoche said, look further. It's what arises out of Vipassana, the prajna that arises out of Vipassana. And when we are able to explore experience itself, we discover the seeming solidity and permanence of all phenomena do not really exist. And this is what comes out of, again, investigating. It's not what habitually occurs to us. It's not what occurs to us on the level of no analysis, because we're quite habituated to taking things to be real in the way that they're not, including an ego, a sense of self that we see as being permanent and ongoing in a way that it isn't. That comes back to no analysis. And this is, again, why he looks at the dream experience. He says dreams are a perfect example of this. We see it, we feel it in the dream, but it doesn't exist. We easily accept that dreams come from our mind, but we still experience it. The burned house breaks the man's heart. So then there's a paragraph here that, on this page, I forget which page it is, but I have my notes, so that really goes through quite a bit in just a few sentences. He starts with, this is how life works. Our minds are creating our experience moment by moment, and we experience these creations as real. So real that we mistakenly assume that we are seeing reality out there independent of our own mind. So this is the basic dualistic split. But let's just go back to the beginning. Our minds are creating our experience moment to moment. And I think this is easiest to see in meditation practice, where we can see how a single thought, just a flicker of feeling, can become a whole world. We just elaborates mushrooms into a whole world. And we can see this in meditation practice. And as we become more familiar with this is how mind works, when we mistake the wave for the ocean, when with the turbulence, we get caught up in the turbulence, we see that we create our experience moment to moment, that it's not, that it's constructed out of all kinds of thoughts, feelings, memories, preconceptions, reference points, habits, habitual ways of perceiving, all of that. So we create our experience, we create a sense of self, we create a sense of the world around us, And we experience these creations as real. That's the next thing that he says, is as if they were real, as opposed to dreamlike, mental creation. So real that we mistakenly assume we're seeing reality out there independent of our own mind. So again, this is the dualistic split that we fall into. This is also in terms of Mahayana, different schools of the Mahayana. Really, what's talked about is as Chittamatra, or mind only. That whatever we experience, every sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, thought, and emotion, memory, is an expression of mind. That when we look at things, some teachers will say, whatever we're looking at, ultimately, we're really just looking at our own mind. In looking at this computer that you're looking at right now, you're looking at your own mind. Because it's mind that creates all these perceptions. And that the sense of duality is that we experience, the sense of a real world out there and a real person here, is a mistaken perception. It's a conceptually created perception. And sometimes we see this, maybe, depending on what people experience in meditation practice, and we really let go and just experience just awareness without any particular reference point of I and other, even for just a glimpse or just a flash of that. All right, but then he goes on to say, but the object of again, this paragraph was packed, I thought. The second sentence is, but the object of perception cannot be separated from the mind that perceives it. So again, where it's that whatever we perceive really can't be separated from the mind that perceives it. And this is again relates to the Chittamatra, the mind only school, that we can only know the world through our own mind, is another way to say it. Now, obviously, this is looking at mind in a very different way from the way that we normally think of mind. Normally we think of mind as just that part of us that thinks or intends and plans or whatever sense we might have of mind. Obviously, this is taking a much vaster view of what mind is, that isn't so centralized into a sense of self that we begin to let go. And we can experience this maybe for just a moment. So if we just maybe just take a moment now to just do a little bit of meditation by taking a good seat, allowing ourselves to slow down, straighten our backs, and settle. And just follow our breathing for a few minutes. Just relax, let go. And just settle into our senses with awareness, particularly sense of sight, but it could be any sense perception really. And just allow ourselves to be open. Whatever we see, hear, feel, smell, taste, perhaps. And just let awareness expand outward. Open up. Relax. And just look at our experience as we settle into nowness. And is there a point where awareness stops and the world begins? A point where the mind stops and the world begins? Just look and see, right into experience of nowness. And if we look, what we see is that if it seems like the mind stops, it's because we create some kind of an idea, some kind of reference point, say the four walls or whatever. And yet we know that there's space beyond that and that we're aware of space beyond that. And we see that there's really no clear boundary. Anyway, we could stay here for a while, but we'll never get done. We only have a few minutes left. So he goes on to say we can't feel our dreams, we can't feel, touch, or taste emptiness. We can't know its origin. We can't even really say that emptiness exists, but that doesn't negate it. It's as real as a dream. And again, it comes back to letting go of our dichotomous thinking, our binary thinking of real, unreal, and really looking at what does it mean to us to say something is real. What do we take to be real? And he says what we're pointing to here is beyond words and language and cannot be known by the conceptual mind. So it really takes a letting go into direct experience beyond concept. And, we just use words as best we can to point to it, to try to have some idea of what it means. We can, conceptual understanding is helpful to a certain point, but then we have to be able to recognize in our experience non-conceptuality, emptiness, openness, and let go. So he says, we've learned to think in dualities, real versus not real, daydreams versus night dreams, good, bad, living, dying. When we encounter experiences that don't fit into these dualities, we tend to dismiss them. They make us nervous. We can't accommodate them into our dualistic logic. So when we're really on the edge of really, questioning what it means to take something as real, what is emptiness, impermanence, all of these things, it can make us nervous because we want something definite to hold on to. And we can, and speaking for myself, when I really get to that point, all I can do is really look at what it feels, that feeling of wanting something to hold on to, and try to just relax with that. That's a point of turbulence, you could say, I guess. And to just look at that experience with awareness and let go as best you can. He says when the convention, and he goes into talking about conventional reality, and this goes back to that level of no analysis that I talked about in the beginning. When the conventional world agrees with what the mind knows with its ordinary perception sums up all that can be known, then it becomes more difficult to pursue the truth. And he's talking here about conventional view of reality, social and cultural. When the conventional world agrees that what the mind knows with its ordinary perceptions, in other words, what the mind knows through concepts, sums up all that can be known, then it becomes more difficult to pursue the truth. And then he says, this paragraph, as we gain more insight into the daytime and nighttime qualities of mind, and this brings us back to chapter 13 again, following what he has had to say there about what we might experience when we look into what happens when we fall asleep, what happens when we dream, and what happens when we first wake up. When we gain more insight into the daytime and nighttime qualities of mind, we gain more confidence in accepting the limits of conventional reality. With investigation, analysis, look further, we can see that the social fabric is pasted together by consensus, and that the more people share the consensus, the more real it becomes, or at least seems to become, and the harder it is to change and dismantle. So here he's talking about, the binding force of seeming consensual reality. And again, that's something for another time, but when we really look into that as well, we realize that even that has its real illusory qualities, that we're all sharing this experience of this class, but we all have our own different perceptions. Even the computer screen, it's similar, but it's not exactly the same, and that we realize that consensus is a little fuzzier, a little more illusory than we might think, and that we never really know exactly what somebody else is feeling or experiencing. And then he tells the story about how difficult it can be to break consensus, consensual, conventional reality, to break those bounds. And tells the story of the king who lived in the kingdom where the well was poisoned, so all the people went kind of crazy, and eventually the king had to drink the water himself just so he could relate to people. He said the king suffered in isolation, but we don't need to. He says we can swim against the stream of conventional reality, conventional conceptions of the world and ego and so on. We can swim against the stream with the help of masters, wisdom texts, and our own intelligence. So then he goes back to back to his experience in the guest house and at the Parinirvana Park, where he goes early in the morning and begins sitting meditation. And here he gives just a little instruction on motivation. And he says that his motivation to become free, he said his motivation is to become free of self-created suffering in order to liberate others, to help liberate others. That's his motivation for practice. Again, basic bodhisattva motivation. And he reflects on why Buddhist tradition places so much emphasis on motivation. Why the Buddhist tradition places so much emphasis on motivation. And the answer he gives is this, that meditation experiences go up and down. And if we become attached to what we think of as good meditation experiences, in other words, those experiences that are pleasurable, peaceful, clear, and easy, we'll become disappointed because sooner or later we'll have other kinds of experiences as well. And he says that the commitment to working with mind means sticking with the intention, the aspiration. We keep trying. Continuous effort has more long-term value than fleeting results. So if our motivation is truly to work with mind, to see how mind works, to see through self-created suffering, to see through these creations of mind that we take to be real in ways that they're not, so that we be free of self-liberated suffering in order to help liberate others. That this gives us the motivation to work with our experience and our meditation practice, whether experiences are up and down, easy or difficult, challenging or not, whether we're dealing with the turbulent emotions and the waves and so on. So with that, he says that he rested his mind in awareness and dedicated the merit, and talks about going to sleep with the intention to recognize the dream within the dream, and succeeds in having a lucid dream in which he flies. Then in the next morning, he says the Buddha became Buddha because he recognized that everything is a dream, including himself. And he ends up talking a little bit about non-attachment, in that he talks about all the things that he enjoyed the next day. He went to buy corn, the vendor refused payment, which he says was the first offering prompted by his monk's robes. He talks about all the things that he enjoyed, the corn, the park, images of home, the vendor, flying in the dream. And he says that all existed equally distant from where he sat. One image was not closer or farther than others, nor could he say that one thought was more real than another. They just drifted through like clouds. And he says that memories of home might snag emotional roots, but the thought of home itself had no stronger roots than an object called home. So he's talking about the translucent awareness, the lack of solidity, had no stronger roots than an object called home than the image of corn lived in a plant called corn. He says, when we stop to investigate the quality of these thought clouds, they emerge more like dreams than what we normally label as real. And he says, neither nighttime dreams nor daytime dreams have substance or durability. Yet until we wake up to reality, day and night perceptions have the capacity to disturb our lives. And then he ends, and I'll end since we're getting to be time. I'm not the same person as I was in Varanasi. In the past 48 hours, I've wandered in hell, taken refuge in a dormitory, spent time with my teachers, hung out with Nagisena, felt sad, lonely, confident, optimistic, and despondent. But the mind that experienced so much agitation is gone. It may be reborn, but either way, it's okay. And he says he felt okay with his decision to slow down the transition to the street, to be gentle with himself, to not force himself into a preconceived goal. He said he hadn't yet died as Mingyur Rinpoche, but he was in between mind states. I'd traverse mindscapes and arrive newly born in this realm with this human body, which is not exactly the same body as yesterday. And again, he says, and again, this comes back to asking us to contemplate impermanence, emptiness, egolessness. If we can appreciate that the body has changed, we can cultivate a sense of renewal and feel energized to fully live our best day before going to sleep and dying all over again. So with that, it's actually a couple minutes over, but we've gotten through all these chapters and we're beginning our return home. So we should close with the dedication of merit. John, can you put it up? I think as long as I'm recording, I can't minimize the screen to get back to the chants. Oh, maybe we'll just do it. I think we all know the dedication of merit. Oh, here we go. By this merit, may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. By the confidence of the golden sun of the great East, may the lotus garden of the Rigdon's wisdom bloom, may the dark ignorance of sentient beings be dispelled, may all beings enjoy profound, brilliant glory.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael and John.
Night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Sleep well or work well.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.